So recently I've been trying to make a very realistic snow shader for extreme close-ups of snow, and I haven't really found any good content on this, so I'm going to make this video on a method I developed on a little system using a bunch of crystals on the snow to sort of break it up and give it a very realistic, physically accurate shader. It's going to be more of actually a geometry solution, even though I call it shader. It's going to involve everything from sort of basic geometry nodes to render settings, and the shaders are actually going to be fairly simple in this. But yeah, let's just jump right into it. Alright, so I'm going to delete out everything to begin with, and I'm going to add in a plane for my snow object. And now the size of this plane is very important. Because we're going to be scattering crystals all over this plane at a particular density, the larger the plane, we're just going to exponentially increase the number of crystals we scatter on this. So I'm going to make this plane quite small because we're going to be going in quite close. Something like this sort of scale should work, 0.5 meters. And now I'll just subdivide this plane once to pull up this middle vertice and then give it a subdivision surface modifier here, and I'm just going to apply that to give it this sort of smoother shape. And now it's time to start adding in our displacements. So once again, I'm going to add a geometry nodes modifier to this. I'm going to hit new and then open up a geonodes editor. And all we're going to be doing is just applying some different levels of displacement. So in order to apply displacement, we're going to be using a set position. And just to demonstrate, I'm going to be using a noise texture first up. I'm going to untick normalize and plug the color into the offset. You can see we move some points around here. And looking at the scale that this is moving, I think I'm actually going to scale this plane up a little bit. So back in edit mode, I'm just going to pull it up a little bit. Now obviously this isn't working quite right, so I'm going to add in a vector math node after the noise texture to scale it down. And if I set this from add to scale, plug that in there, I'll set the strength to 0.1. You can see now we're just randomly moving the points around by this noise texture. Now we don't have many points to move around, so to fix that I'm going to add in a subdivision surface modifier. And I want to set this to something really high because I want quite a bit of detail in this displacement. But it's going to make it very slow to work with in the viewport. So for now, let's just set it to something like 4. I'll probably want to set it to something like 6 in the render though. So to achieve this, I'll use a switch node. And this just basically lets you switch between two inputs based on if this is true or false. And I'm going to set this to integer. And now if I plug into this true or false, is viewport, this will basically return true if we're in the viewport and false if we're in the render. So if we're in the render I want 6 subdivisions, if we're in the viewport I want 4. And I'll plug that into levels. And now I can play with this noise texture to achieve any kind of result I'm looking for. For now I'm going to leave it at default and I'm just going to move it over here, and I'm just going to disable it for now by pressing M over this set position to mute the node. And that's because I want to add in another set position before it. I'll make a bit of space here because I'm going to be making a Voronoi displacement setup. So I'm going to grab a Voronoi texture. And in order to plug this into the set position, it's not quite as simple as with the noise texture because we can't just plug any of these inputs directly in. They won't behave like we want them to. So instead, what I'm going to do is use the normal of the mesh. And if you don't know what the normal is, it's just a vector basically pointing perpendicular to every face. So it'd be something like that for this mesh, basically just points outward. And I want to scale the normal. And if I plug that directly into the offset, you can see we're just moving this up or down. I don't want to move it up and down by just a number though, I want to move it by this Voronoi texture. And you can see now we get some interesting looking displacement. And you can see if I go to the underside of this, we get these more interesting shapes, especially if I turn the scale down, you can see we get more spherical shapes, and at the top we get these sort of concave shapes. I want the spherical ones to be at the top, so I'm going to invert this. And to do that, I'm going to add in another scale node after this, and just set the scale to -1. And now you'll notice that our sort of mid-level has seemed to have dropped below the floor, and that's just because of the values of this distance output. We just need to add a small offset to them to recenter this. So playing with the add node, actually let's set this to subtract and leave it at 0.5. And you can see that centers everything again. And now to control the strength of this, I'm going to use a multiply node before we plug into the scale. And plug this down. Now you could use a scale after this and set it to a lower number to scale it in the same way like this. But the reason I'm not doing it like that is because I want to combine multiple Voronoi textures and I want to be able to control the strengths independently. So I want to set this one to be somewhat of a large scale effect at a fairly low strength. Something like that works quite nicely. I'm also going to right click shade smooth on this mesh. Okay, so that's our first Voronoi in, and I'm going to duplicate this and add another one. And then to combine these two, I'm just going to use an add node, like so. Turn up the scale of this one to be more of a high detail scale. The reason I'm doing all of this Voronoi setup as well is just based on reference, basically trying to match reference as closely as possible. Snow, when you're really close up to it, at least sometimes tends to form these sort of lumpy shapes. It can be quite smooth though, so, you know, it just depends on the kind of snow that you're wanting to create, really. I think I want one more Voronoi now. I'm going to add in another one at a higher scale. Very high detail one at a much lower scale. Maybe 0.01. 0.02, and you can see we're losing some resolution. I might just turn up this subdivision temporarily to see this, and I'm just going to tweak the scales until I'm happy with them. You can see that the shapes aren't like perfectly spherical here. They're not as smooth as I quite like them to be. So before we do any of this to the Voronoi textures, I'm going to add in a node to each of them. I'm going to set it to power. And I'm basically just going to square each of these before we do anything to them. And in that way you can see that we're smoothing out the shapes a lot more. So now you can see we have this interesting lumpy shape going on. I'm going to start adding this noise in afterwards. And I'm going to unmute this node. And it pretty much ruins everything, so we need to turn the scale way down. 0.01, and I'll turn the scale on the noise texture way up. And the purpose of this noise is just to sort of break up the perfectly spherical shapes going on. Just make it a little bit more raggedy. But you can see a problem if I go too far. We start getting these intersections where the mesh intersects with itself. And this is going to be a problem because it's just going to render as black when we start rendering this. If I show you in rendered mode, I'm going to set this to cycles on the GPU. This shader is only going to work in cycles basically because of how physically accurate it's going to be. But if I just turn off scene lights and scene world just temporarily, you can see that if I go too far with this, we start getting these black areas where the mesh intersects itself. So you want to make sure that you avoid those. Okay, now I'm fairly happy with this, so I'm going to just decrease this back down to 4 subdivisions in the viewport. And there's one last thing I think I want to do to this. It's not particularly necessary in this case, but sometimes it can be helpful to remove some of those intersections, is to use another set position after this. And we're basically going to smooth out the shape a little bit without using another subdivision. And the way we're going to do this is take the position and plug this straight into the position. This does nothing now, we're just setting the position to the same thing they're already at. But I'm going to actually run the position through a blur. And if I set this blur to vector, what we're now doing is essentially, well, we're just blurring the position path. So we're sort of merging all the nearby vertices into the same sort of value range. So I think we'll go for something like a weight of 0.2. We only really want one iteration of this. A very sort of subtle effect. But yeah, now we have our little Voronoi setup here. We have our extra noise on top just to break it up, and we have our smoothing function. But that all seems fine to me, so I'm going to rename this group to displacement. And now it's time to start working on the crystal that we're going to scatter over this mesh. So to make this crystal, I'm going to start with a curve, just because it's going to be easiest when we're using geometry nodes to convert this curve into a mesh. So I'm actually going to rotate this by 90 degrees in the y-axis, and I'll just move it off over to the side for now, and I'll tweak the shape a little bit so that it's a bit more straight. Now let's make a geometry nodes group on this, and let's get started. So essentially what I want to do is first of all mesh this to make this kind of tapering shape, which is going to be super simple. So we are going to convert this curve to a mesh using a curve to mesh node. And in the profile curve, I'll plug in a circle. It has to be a curved circle. You can see we just get a cylinder from that. I'm going to decrease the resolution to 8. We don't need a lot of resolution for this. And I'll turn the radius down a bit. And now if I use a set radius node, set curve radius, before we mesh this, and then in the radius, now I can control that again, but the difference is this time we can control it along the length of the curve. So I'm going to use the spline parameter factor to basically taper this off. And I'll also tick fill caps on this to fill the end faces. And now I don't want this to actually go to a complete point, so I'm going to use a ramp after this factor and just bring up the black value. So it goes to maybe a radius of 0.3 at the top. And that's literally our first step done. Now all we need to do is instance on this some extra curves that are sort of pointing out in a spiky way. So before we do any of this radius and meshing stuff, I'm going to take the raw input and do a curve to points on this. And if I just view this quickly, you can see now what we're doing is just, despite the large point scale, we're just basically taking the curve and converting it to a series of points that are sort of evenly distributed on it. So I'll go for something like 7. And now let's instance on these points. And what we're going to instance on them is actually going to be additional curves. So let's grab a curve line, plug that into the instance, and you can see we just get them all pointing off here. And let's randomly rotate them based on the curve. I could actually plug in the rotation off this curve to points node, and they'll sort of follow the curve in a nice way. So let's start with that and just use a vector math on this. And if I add some value to this, I can offset them, and I want to use a random value here. Set to vector. And now in the X, I want them roughly to all be pointing the same way, so I'll increase those to be roughly the same value. And then I'll just spin them around on the Y, it seems. It's the correct axes, till they're all sort of pointing in these random ways. And I'll maybe decrease the length of this curve line. Let's join that back up to our mesh here. There's a nice shortcut for joining two things here. If we hold Control Shift and right click drag, we can join two things in the node editor. I use that quite a lot. I think looking at this, we probably want more points. Maybe we want to decrease the radius a little bit. And now we want to mesh these instance curves. So let's go ahead and do that. So to convert these instances back into meshed objects, let's just run them through the same curve to mesh setup. Like so. And let's set the radius in the same way as well. Now obviously these seem to be inverted, so let's flip the values on this ramp, and let's also turn our radius down a lot too. And now that we have this sort of mess of an object, let's go ahead and remesh this. And we're going to remesh it in geometry nodes using a little technique. Basically, we're going to be converting this mesh to a volume, not points. Mesh to volume. And we basically get a volume out of this, which merges all the intersections together and creates this sort of natural tapering around there. And then we're going to convert this volume back to a mesh. And I'm going to define this by size again. And you can see that this isn't actually doing what I said it would do, where we're getting a nice merge where they intersect. And the reason for this is that these curves are still technically instances after they come from this instance on points node. So I'm just going to drop in a realize instances node at the end of this little chain, and that converts them to the same type of geometry so they can be meshed together. And you can play with the voxel amount on both of these. I would recommend mainly tweaking the voxel amount on them both, sort of by the same amount roughly, till you get the kind of resolution that you're looking for. And now that I'm looking at this all meshed, I'm going to just tweak it a little bit more again. Maybe play with the seed, and maybe more points. And remember, this is always going to look ugly. It doesn't really matter. We're going to be looking at this at a tiny, tiny scale. And there's just one last thing left to do, and that is to set this to be shaded smooth. And let's give it a material 2. Let's give it a material in its own slot, call it ice, and just set it in here. And now that brings us on, we're ready to now shade and distribute this crystal across this snow. So before we do the distribution, let's first set up a basic shader on this snow object. So I'm going to give it a material, call it snow, go into rendered mode, and I'm actually going to turn scene lights and scene world back on for now. I'm going to set the scene world to be a brighter bluey color, something like that. And let's turn on transparent film in the render settings, just so we can focus on the objects we're looking at. And let's Shift A, add in a point light, drag it up above this snow, just something like that for now. Maybe increase the intensity till we're sort of slightly blowing out. It's pretty good. Now on this snow shader, if you can't find your stuff, just A to select all and then numpad full stop. Let's give this a base color that is pure white instead of 0.8 by default. Set that up to 1. And let's go ahead and give this a subsurface component. And all subsurface does is, you've probably seen it a lot in skin, is show a sort of color beneath the surface, sort of imitating light sort of going into the object and then bouncing around inside of it and coming back out. So you can see we're getting a red tinge to this, and the color is actually based on this radius, so I'm going to set this all to 1. And if I play with the scale, this is going to be the main effect. You can see if I set it to 0, we have no effect, and the more I increase it, the more we sort of soften things up. So I'll set it to something like 0.1, and let's just turn the roughness up a little bit on this base material. And now we're never really going to see this because it's going to be covered in this crystal, but it's good to get a nice basic shader in case we ever do see it. And on this ice shader, let's again take this value up to 1, and let's turn the roughness, let's actually leave it at 0.5. I'm just going to turn the transmission up to 1, so this becomes a transmissive material. Maybe let's turn the roughness down to 0.4, something like that. And let's actually set the IOR to 1.33, and that's the IOR of water, which is what ice is. So now back on this base plane, let's go back into geometry nodes, and you could add your crystal setup in this same node tree, but I want to add it as a different modifier because again it's going to be very slow, so I'm going to turn it off in the viewport. Let's add a new modifier here, click new, and let's call this crystal scatter. And it's going to be a very basic scatter setup. We're just going to distribute points on faces. You can see now we get a bunch of points here. We lose our base mesh, so let's join that back in. And let's up the density to, let's start with 1000. And we're actually going to render it a much higher density of this when we come to render. So let's set that up now with a switch node again. We're going to use a float. and is viewport in the switch again. Now you could again just type in values here, but I want to make a little setup here so that it's a bit more intuitive. I'm going to type in a value node set to 1000, plug that into the viewport, which is the true, and then in the render I basically just want to make it like maybe 1000 times what we're seeing in the viewport. So now as I sort of tweak this node, we know the render's getting updated relatively as well. So let's instance on these points now. And we want to instance our curve object, which is our crystal. Plug that into the instance. And you can see we have some problems to begin with. First of all, let's fix the rotation by plugging that in. And the main problem is we're just at way too high of a scale right now, so let's add in a transform geometry. And I want to affect all these values at once, so I'm going to add in a value node. So it's 2.1, plug that into the scale. I actually want to make this even smaller, so I'm going to add in a math node and divide this by, say, 100. So we really are getting some tiny crystals. And you can see the crystals are actually all lying down, so I'm going to rotate them as well on their Y, I think, by 90 degrees. And let's make sure on our crystal object that we put the base at the origin so they don't go underneath the snow surface. Like that. Perfect. To make this a little nicer in the viewport, what I like to do when I'm working with lots of instances is turn off outline in the workbench settings. Just makes it a bit nicer to see. And now let's add some randomness to this. So I'm going to, in the rotation, do another vector math and use a random value in here. And let's set this to 0 for now so we can find the correct axes. I just want to shift them slightly this way and this way and spin them around by a bunch of randomness. And let's randomize the scale. And this is actually one of the instances where I think a vector might be more suitable for the scale, so we can randomize it on all dimensions. So I'll set this back to 1 for now. And I don't really care if I distort them in this way on each axis because, well, really I don't think we're going to be able to tell anyway, and it's just going to allow it to fill up a little bit more, if that makes any sense. Now, if I go into rendered mode, we're not really going to be able to see much in the viewport, because like I say, we're going to need a lot more of these before we start to see any noticeable effect. But we are going to run in a few problems when we render this. If we don't address them now, we're just basically going to end up with a black material. Because even though we're in, 4.2 and the shaders are better than they used to be in terms of light energy preservation, they're still not perfect, and that's just because of how we are going to be rendering this with a limited number of light paths. So if you didn't know, when you're rendering glass materials or anything that has a transmission component, the transmission depth is quite important, and so is the glossy depth. And this is the number of reflections that can occur sort of often on this glass, because glass both reflects and refracts light. So I'm going to set these both to 12. I won't worry about the diffuse. And essentially, the problem we're going to run into is that when light goes through this whole sea of these, we're going to reach this limit quite quickly. So we're going to want to add some sort of switch in the shader to turn the glass off when we reach that limit. So we're going to use a mix shader node, and we're going to use a light path node. And what this node essentially allows us to do is read information from the renderer into the shader. So we can say that if our transparent and glossy depth, not transparent depth, if our transmission and glossy depth exceed a certain threshold, which will be 12 like we've set here, then switch this shader to be transparent so that the rays can just exit the material and no longer try to refract or reflect off anything. So to make that statement, I'm going to first of all take the glossy depth, set this to a greater than 12, and let's take the transmission depth greater than 12, and to combine these two I'm just going to add them. So if either one of these things is true, this will be set to 1. And then we will switch to the transparent shader, like so. Now, because we're going to be setting a lot of these crystals to be transparent at render time, we're going to want to up our transparent bounces to something like the maximum of 1024. And the reason for that is if we don't, we're basically going to end up with black dots as the rays sort of terminate midway through. So that's that little optimization added, so we don't have to render with thousands of bounces. You technically don't need this if you set these to render at like 1000, but it's just a nice little optimization. I want to add one more optimization, which is a bit more of a subtle problem that you might not realize, but after sort of watching this talk from the Blender conference about glass rendering, there's this effect that can occur where basically a ray of light can enter a glass object, particularly of cylindrical shape, like our crystals on the snow, and it can enter at such an angle that it will bounce around inside of it forever, and it can sort of get trapped inside of that. And that's called total internal reflection. And in order to remove this effect from this material, I'm going to use another mix shader with transparent, and I'm going to use the light path node again. And we're going to say ray depth this time. And what ray depth is just how many times has a particular ray interacted with anything, really. So in our case, it's basically going to say if this ray has sort of reflected a certain number of times within this object, we're just going to set the object to be transparent so the ray can leave. So I'm going to use a greater than, set this to something like 10, and plug that into the factor. I found 10 to work fine, it doesn't really make any noticeable difference. And now we should be good to render this now. So let's do our first test. I'm just going to set my samples down to 128 for now. Before we render this, we actually need to add a camera in. I forgot. Let's just add that in and then camera to view. And as this starts to render, you can see that we're getting already quite a realistic result. Things are looking quite bright and there's no real artifacts going on in this, which is pretty good. I think the main things I'd want to tweak about this are maybe that displacement setup in the geometry nodes. Maybe it is not enough noise or too lumpy or something, but maybe it feels a bit too perfect. But overall, I think the crystals are working pretty well at the density we've set them up. The density will technically be 1 million at render time because we've done 1000 times 1000, which is why I urge you not to apply this setup to a large piece of snow in your scene. Only try and do it on small areas. And yeah, this should be more than suitable for any sort of close-up shot. You can pretty much get as close as you want to the snow and it will always look pretty good. But yeah, you can keep tweaking your little displacement setup on this, and I hope you can make some cool renders out of this. If you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment and I'll try to respond to them all. But yeah, hopefully you can make some cool renders out of this.